You're a Roman citizen living in a prosperous city along the Danube frontier in 4047 AD. You wake up to the sound of screaming, not the usual morning sounds of merchants hawking their wares or children playing in the streets, but the raw, primal screaming of people facing death. You rush to your window and see something that will haunt you for the rest of your very short life. An endless sea of horsemen pouring over the hills like a dark tide, their war cries echoing off the mountains as they descend toward your home. These aren't ordinary raiders looking for quick plunder. These are the Huns, and at their head rides a man so terrifying that people across Europe whisper his name in the same breath as the devil himself. They call him the Scourge of God, Attila the Hun, and in the next few hours your city, your family, and everyone you've ever known will cease to exist. Welcome to the world of the most cruel king in history. A man who didn't just conquer territories or demand tribute, but who systematically erased entire civilizations from the map, with a thoroughness that would make modern genocidal dictators take notes. So settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Tonight we're diving into the life and reign of a man who turned mass slaughter into an art form, who left behind him a trail of empty cities and depopulated regions that wouldn't recover for centuries. This isn't the romanticized barbarian king of Hollywood movies. This is the real Attila, and the real Attila was absolutely terrifying. Let's start with what made Attila so uniquely horrible compared to other ancient conquerors. See, most ancient rulers, even the cruel ones, had some kind of logic to their violence. They conquered to expand their empires. They killed to secure their borders. They enslaved people to build their economies. The violence had a purpose beyond the violence itself. But Attila was different. Attila seemed to understand that terror itself was a weapon more powerful than any sword or siege engine. He didn't just want to defeat his enemies, he wanted to break them so completely that the mere mention of his name would cause entire armies to flee without fighting. He didn't just want to conquer territories, he wanted to erase them so thoroughly that future generations would forget they had ever existed. This wasn't the random brutality of a madman, or the passionate revenge of a wronged king. This was calculated, systematic, industrial-scale cruelty, designed to achieve specific psychological and political effects. Attila had figured out something that wouldn't be fully understood by military theorists until the 20th century, that the fear of violence could be more effective than violence itself, but only if that fear was backed up by violence so extreme and so total that it became legendary. The numbers alone should give you nightmares. During Attila's roughly 20-year reign as king of the Huns, it's estimated that his campaigns directly resulted in the deaths of over 1 million people. But that's just the direct casualties, the people who died in battles, massacres, and sieges. The indirect death toll from famine, disease, displacement, and societal collapse in the wake of his campaigns was probably several times higher. When we talk about Attila devastating entire regions of Europe, we're not speaking metaphorically. Archaeological evidence shows layer after layer of burned cities, abandoned settlements, and mass graves that date to the period of Hun expansion. Some areas didn't recover their pre-Attila population levels until the High Middle Ages. Nearly 500 years later, the Balkans, northern Italy, and large swaths of modern-day Germany and France were so thoroughly devastated that they remained essentially uninhabited wastelands for decades after his death. But raw numbers don't capture the true horror of what Attila represented. What made him uniquely terrifying was the systematic nature of his cruelty, and the obvious pleasure he took in inflicting suffering. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man who would personally oversee mass executions, who would order entire populations to be tortured before being killed, and who seemed to derive genuine satisfaction from watching cities burn. The Byzantine historian Priscus, who actually met Attila in person during a diplomatic mission in 449 AD, described him as having a restless character and eyes that flashed terribly. Other contemporary sources describe him as short and stocky, with a large head, small eyes, and a thin beard. But what struck everyone who encountered him wasn't his physical appearance, it was the aura of barely contained violence that surrounded him like a cloud. Attila understood that reputation was everything in the ancient world. A king who was known to be merciless would face less resistance than one who was known to be merciful, because people would surrender rather than face the consequences of defying him. But Attila took this logic to its extreme conclusion, creating a reputation for cruelty that was so extreme it bordered on the supernatural. Kommentar King encouraged stories about his own brutality, making sure that tales of his massacres spread far and wide. He would deliberately spare a few survivors from each city he destroyed, not out of mercy, but so they could flee to other settlements and spread terror about what they had witnessed. These traumatized refugees became his unwitting propaganda agents, carrying stories of Hun atrocities that would cause other cities to surrender without a fight. And here's where we get to one of the 4 key aspects of Attila's cruelty that earned him his fearsome reputation. He practiced mass slaughter and enslavement on a scale that was unprecedented even in the brutal ancient world. But this wasn't just about killing large numbers of people. It was about the systematic, methodical way he went about destroying human communities. When Attila's forces captured a city, they didn't just kill the military defenders and move on. They killed everyone. Men, women, children, elderly, sick, healthy. No one was spared. But even that wasn't enough. The killing was done slowly, publicly, and with maximum psychological impact. People were tortured before being executed. Families were forced to watch each other die. Children were killed in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. The enslavement was equally systematic and brutal. Hun raids would sweep up entire populations, marching them away from their homes to serve as laborers, concubines, or simply as examples of Hun power. But unlike other ancient civilizations that enslaved people for economic reasons, the Huns often enslaved people primarily to demonstrate their dominance and to inflict maximum suffering on their enemies. Hun slaves were deliberately mistreated, not because the Huns needed to break them for productive labor, but because public displays of cruelty toward captives served to intimidate other potential enemies. Slaves would be tortured, mutilated, or killed in elaborate public ceremonies specifically designed to send messages about what happened to people who resisted Hun authority. But here's what makes Attila's story even more chilling. He wasn't some barbarian savage who stumbled into power through luck or circumstance. He was intelligent, politically sophisticated, and militarily brilliant. He spoke multiple languages, understood complex diplomatic negotiations, and was capable of long-term strategic planning. His cruelty wasn't the product of ignorance or primitive culture. It was the calculated decision of a brilliant mind that had decided that terror was the most efficient tool for achieving his goals. To understand how Attila became the monster he was, we need to look at the world he grew up in and the forces that shaped him. Because Attila didn't emerge from nowhere, he was the product of a specific time, place, and culture that had been developing for centuries before his birth. The Huns first appeared on the edges of European consciousness in the late 4th century, migrating westward from the steppes of Central Asia, in a movement that would reshape the entire continent. These weren't random nomadic raids. This was a massive population migration driven by climate change, political pressures, and the collapse of established power structures in the East. The Huns were a confederation of tribal groups that had been welded together through conquest and alliance into a formidable military machine. They were master horsemen, expert archers, and specialists in mobile warfare that could cover vast distances at incredible speed. But more importantly for our story, they had developed a culture that celebrated violence, valued military prowess above all other virtues, and saw cruelty as a sign of strength rather than moral weakness. Attila was born into this culture sometime around 406 AD, probably in the region that is now Hungary. His father was Munzuk, a powerful Hun chieftain, and his uncle was Ruga, who ruled the Huns as king. From birth, Attila would have been surrounded by warriors, raised on stories of conquest and massacre, and trained to see violence as the natural solution to any problem. The Hun society that shaped Attila was fundamentally different from the settled civilizations of Rome and Byzantium. It was a nomadic culture built around constant warfare, where status was determined by skill in battle and success in raiding. Children were taught to ride horses before they could walk properly, and they learned to shoot arrows from horseback, while most Roman children were still learning their letters. But Attila's education wasn't limited to Hun military culture. The Huns had been in contact with the Roman Empire for decades by the time of his birth, sometimes as enemies, sometimes as allies, always as a threat that Romans had to take seriously. As a member of the Hun royal family, Attila would have been exposed to Roman diplomatic practices, Roman military techniques, and Roman political sophistication. Attila grew up understanding both the brutal effectiveness of Hun military culture and the complex political dynamics of the civilized world he planned to conquer. He learned to think like a Roman while fighting like a Hun, and that made him far more dangerous than either culture could have produced on its own. The Hun confederation that Attila inherited was already a formidable force by the time he came to power. Under his uncle Ruger, and during his joint rule with his brother Bleda, the Huns had established themselves as the dominant military power in Central and Eastern Europe. They had forced the Eastern Roman Empire to pay tribute, had absorbed numerous Germanic tribes into their confederation, and had created a vast network of client states and vassal peoples. But the Hun Empire was also fundamentally unstable. It was held together by the personal authority of its leaders, and the promise of continual plunder and conquest. If the flow of wealth from raids and tribute payments ever stopped, if the military machine ever appeared to weaken, the entire confederation could collapse overnight as the various tribal groups went their separate ways. Attila understood this instability better than anyone, and it drove his entire approach to leadership. He knew that he couldn't simply maintain the status quo. He had to constantly demonstrate Hun power and provide his followers with fresh victories and new sources of plunder. This need for constant warfare and continual conquest would ultimately drive him to unleash campaigns of unprecedented brutality across Europe. The Huns under Attila's predecessors had already established a pattern of extracting tribute from the Roman Empire through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation. The Romans found it cheaper to pay the Huns to stay away than to fight them directly, and this arrangement had worked reasonably well for everyone involved. The Huns got gold and luxury goods without having to fight for them, and the Romans got peace along their northern frontier. But this system also taught the Huns something crucial about Roman psychology. The Romans were afraid of them, not just cautious or concerned, but genuinely terrified. The Huns had discovered that they could achieve more through the threat of violence than through violence itself, as long as that threat was backed up by occasional demonstrations of what they were capable of doing. Attila learned this lesson well, but he also understood something that his predecessors had missed. The threat of violence only worked as long as people believed you were willing and able to carry it out. If you became too comfortable with tribute payments and peaceful negotiations, people might start to think you had gone soft. The only way to maintain credibility as a threat was to occasionally prove that you were still as dangerous as ever. This understanding would drive Attila's entire approach to kingship. He would use diplomacy when it served his purposes, but he would also unleash devastating military campaigns specifically designed to remind everyone why they should be afraid of him. The cruelty wasn't a byproduct of his military campaigns, it was the point of them. When Attila became sole king of the Huns in 445 AD, following the death of his uncle Ruger and the mysterious death of his brother Bleda, whom many suspect Attila murdered, he inherited a powerful but unstable confederation. The various tribal groups that made up the Hun Empire were held together primarily by the promise of plunder and the fear of Hun military might. If that military might ever appeared to weaken, the confederation could collapse overnight. The death of Bleda was particularly significant because it eliminated the last potential rival to Attila's authority within the Hun royal family. Bleda had been the more cautious and diplomatic of the two brothers, preferring negotiation to warfare, and generally satisfied with the tribute payments that were flowing in from the Roman Empire. Attila, by contrast, was ambitious, aggressive, and constantly looking for new ways to demonstrate Hun power. Contemporary sources suggest that Bleda died under suspicious circumstances during a hunting expedition, and while no one could prove that Attila was responsible, the timing was certainly convenient. With Bleda out of the way, Attila was free to pursue the aggressive expansion that he believed was necessary to maintain Hun unity and his own position as king. Attila's solution to the problem of maintaining Hun unity was characteristically brutal. He would demonstrate Hun power through campaigns of such devastating cruelty that no one would ever again question Hun military supremacy. He would create a reign of terror so complete and so memorable that the fear of Hun retribution would hold his empire together long after his death. This decision would doom millions of people across Europe to deaths of unimaginable brutality, but from Attila's perspective, it was simply good political strategy. He was sacrificing the lives of his enemies to secure the loyalty of his followers and the stability of his kingdom. The fact that this strategy required mass slaughter on an industrial scale was to him simply the cost of doing business. But before we dive into the specific campaigns that earned Attila his title as the Scourge of God, we need to understand the military machine he used to spread terror across Europe. Because the Hun army wasn't just effective, it was specifically designed to maximize psychological impact and civilian casualties in ways that made it uniquely suited for the kind of warfare Attila preferred. Trompendaken, the core of Hun military power, was their cavalry. These weren't the heavy cavalry knights of later medieval warfare, but light, fast-moving horsemen who could cover enormous distances at incredible speed. A Hun army could appear without warning, strike with devastating effect, and disappear before their enemies could organize an effective response. Hun horses were small but incredibly hardy, capable of surviving on minimal forage and covering up to 60 miles per day across rough terrain. This mobility gave the Huns a strategic advantage that was almost impossible for their enemies to counter. While Roman armies were tied to roads and supply lines, Hun forces could move across country at will, striking where they were least expected and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. But what made Hun cavalry truly terrifying wasn't just their speed and mobility, it was their archery. Hun warriors were trained from childhood to shoot arrows from horseback with deadly accuracy. They could maintain a constant barrage of arrow fire while moving at full gallop, turning their horses into mobile weapons platforms that could strike and retreat without ever coming within reach of enemy weapons. The Hun composite bow was a masterpiece of ancient military technology, capable of penetrating armor at distances of up to 300 yards. Made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, these bows were incredibly powerful and accurate in skilled hands. A single Hun archer could carry up to 60 arrows into battle, giving him enough ammunition to fight for hours without resupply. This combination of mobility and ranged firepower made the Huns nearly impossible to defeat in open battle. Traditional infantry formations, which were the backbone of Roman military power, were helpless against enemies who could shoot them full of arrows from a distance and then ride away before they could retaliate. Even when Roman armies did manage to close with Hun forces, the Huns would simply retreat, regroup, and attack again from a different direction. The psychological impact of Hun military tactics was even more important than their tactical effectiveness. The sound of thousands of horses thundering across the landscape, the whistle of arrows filling the air, the war cries of Hun warriors echoing off the hills. All of this was specifically designed to create terror in their enemies before the actual fighting even began. Hun armies also employed deliberate psychological warfare tactics that were calculated to break enemy morale. They would drive captured civilians ahead of their advancing forces, using them as human shields and forcing defenders to choose between killing their own people or allowing the Huns to approach their walls. They would display the heads of captured enemies on spears, conduct public executions in view of besieged cities, and deliberately target religious sites and cultural symbols that had special meaning for their enemies. The Huns also understood the power of reputation in ancient warfare. They made sure that stories of their atrocities spread far and wide, often deliberately exaggerating their own brutality to increase the psychological impact. They would leave a few survivors from each massacre specifically to spread tales of Hun cruelty, knowing that these traumatized witnesses would cause more terror than any amount of official propaganda. Attila took all of these traditional Hun military and psychological warfare techniques and systematized them, turning them into a coherent strategy for conquest through terror. Under his leadership, the Huns didn't just defeat their enemies, they erased them so completely that other potential enemies would surrender rather than face the same fate. The logistics of Hun warfare were also specifically designed to maximize civilian casualties and economic destruction. Hun armies didn't carry extensive supply trains like Roman legions, they lived off the land, which meant that their very presence in a region guaranteed famine and economic collapse for the local population. Hun forces would systematically strip a region of everything edible, burning what they couldn't take with them and poisoning water sources to deny them to their enemies. They would deliberately target agricultural infrastructure, destroying mills, granaries, and irrigation systems that took decades to build but could be ruined in a matter of hours. This scorched earth approach served multiple purposes. It denied resources to enemy armies, created refugee populations that would strain the resources of neighboring regions, and ensured that areas conquered by the Huns would remain uninhabitable long after the Hun armies had moved on. It was a deliberate strategy of economic warfare designed to create long-term devastation that would serve as a warning to other potential enemies. This brings us to another crucial aspect of Attila's systematic cruelty. He left cities completely depopulated. This wasn't just about killing people during battles or sieges. It was about ensuring that entire urban centers ceased to exist as functioning communities. When Attila was finished with a city, it wasn't just conquered or occupied. It was empty, dead, gone. The systematic depopulation of cities served multiple strategic purposes. It eliminated potential centers of resistance, created vast empty zones that would serve as buffers between Hun territory and potential enemies, and demonstrated Hun power in the most dramatic way possible. When travelers came across the ruins of cities that Attila had destroyed, they found not just damaged buildings but complete silence where once there had been thriving communities. This depopulation was achieved through a combination of massacre, enslavement, and forced displacement. Those who weren't killed outright were marched away to serve as slaves in distant regions, ensuring that they could never return to rebuild their communities. The few who managed to escape or hide during the initial assault found that there was nothing left to return to. No homes, no infrastructure, no community to rejoin. The Huns also practiced systematic enslavement on a massive scale, but their approach to slavery was different from that of other ancient civilizations. Most ancient empires enslaved people to provide labor for economic production. They wanted their slaves alive and healthy enough to work. The Huns enslaved people primarily to demonstrate their power and to create additional psychological pressure on their enemies. Hun slaves were often deliberately mistreated, not because the Huns needed to break them for productive labor, but because public displays of cruelty toward captives served to intimidate other potential enemies. Slaves would be tortured, mutilated, or killed in elaborate public ceremonies specifically designed to send messages about what happened to people who resisted Hun authority. Death in battle was quick, but enslavement by the Huns could mean months or years of systematic torture before eventual death. The knowledge that capture meant prolonged suffering rather than quick death added an additional layer of terror to Hun military campaigns. The Huns also used their slaves as psychological weapons in subsequent campaigns. They would force captured soldiers to fight in the front ranks of their armies, knowing that defenders would recognize their former comrades and be demoralized by seeing them fighting for the enemy. They would parade captured leaders in chains before the walls of besieged cities, demonstrating the fate that awaited anyone who continued to resist. Hun slavery was also distinguished by its complete lack of any possibility for advancement or eventual freedom. In many ancient societies, slaves could earn or buy their freedom, or at least improve their circumstances through good service. Hun slaves had no such hope. They were property to be used and discarded at will, with no prospect of ever being anything more than objects of their master's cruelty. The scale of Hun enslavement was staggering. Contemporary sources suggest that major Hun raids could capture tens of thousands of slaves at a time, with entire regions being swept clean of their populations. These mass enslavements served not just to provide labor, but to demonstrate Hun power and to create the empty landscapes that Attila preferred to leave in his wake. By the time Attila reached the height of his power in the 440s and 450s AD, the Hun military machine had been refined into an instrument of terror that was uniquely effective at achieving its goals through cruelty. This wasn't random brutality or the expression of primitive savagery. It was a sophisticated system of psychological and physical warfare designed by intelligent people who understood exactly what they were doing and why. And at the head of this machine was Attila himself, a man who had spent his entire life learning how to use fear and violence as tools of statecraft. He was about to unleash this machine on Europe in a series of campaigns that would earn him his title as the Scourge of God and demonstrate just how effective systematic cruelty could be as a method of conquest. But to understand the true horror of what Attila would accomplish, we need to look at his first major campaign as sole ruler of the Huns, the devastating invasion of the Eastern Roman Empire that would establish his reputation and set the pattern for all his future conquests. The year was 447 AD, and Attila had been sole king of the Huns for 2 years following the convenient death of his brother Bleda. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, had been paying tribute to the Huns for decades, but the payments had recently become irregular, and the amounts had been reduced. The Romans probably thought they were dealing with just another barbarian king who could be managed through a combination of diplomacy and minimal payments. They were catastrophically wrong. Attila's response to the reduced tribute payments was swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating. But this wasn't a raid or a punitive expedition. It was a systematic campaign of extermination designed to send a message that would echo across the known world for centuries. This campaign would establish his reputation as the scourge of God and demonstrate to the world exactly what kind of monster they were dealing with. The title Scourge of God wasn't just a dramatic epithet. It reflected a genuine belief among contemporaries that Attila was an instrument of divine wrath, sent to punish the civilized world for its sins. The Christian writer Prosper of Aquitaine described him as the destroyer of nations, while the historian Jordanes called him the terror of all lands. Even among the Huns themselves, Attila was seen as something more than human, a king who had been chosen by the gods to bring devastation to the world. This reputation for supernatural malevolence was exactly what Attila wanted. By encouraging people to see him as more than human, as an agent of divine judgment rather than simply another barbarian king, he was creating a psychological weapon that was more powerful than any army. When people believed that you were literally sent by God to destroy them, resistance became not just futile but sacrilegious. The Hun army that crossed the Danube in the spring of 447 was enormous by the standards of ancient warfare. Estimates suggest it included over 100,000 warriors, plus an unknown number of auxiliaries, slaves, and camp followers. But size alone wasn't what made this army terrifying. What made it terrifying was the systematic way it went about destroying everything in its path. The first major city to fall was Marcianopolis, a prosperous trading center in what is now Bulgaria. The Hun siege of Marcianopolis established the pattern that would be followed throughout the campaign, and would define Attila's approach to warfare for the rest of his career. Rather than simply capturing the city and moving on, Attila ordered its complete destruction. Contemporary accounts describe the fall of Marcianopolis in terms that sound almost biblical in their horror. The Huns didn't just kill the defenders, they systematically murdered every man, woman, and child in the city. But even that wasn't enough for Attila. He ordered that the city be burned so thoroughly that nothing would remain standing, and that the very foundations be torn up and scattered so that future travelers wouldn't even be able to tell that a city had once stood there. This wasn't military necessity. Marcianopolis had already surrendered and posed no further threat. This was deliberate terrorism designed to send a message to every other city in the empire. Resistance was futile, surrender was not an option, and the only choice was between dying quickly in battle or dying slowly under torture after the city fell. The destruction of Marcianopolis took 3 days, and each day was carefully orchestrated to maximize the psychological impact on witnesses and survivors. Hun warriors spent the first day killing everyone they could find, systematically going house by house to ensure that no one escaped the slaughter. The killing wasn't random or frenzied, it was methodical, thorough, and designed to be as horrifying as possible. The second day was devoted to collecting valuables and selecting slaves from among any survivors who had been spared for that purpose. But even this practical activity was turned into a form of psychological warfare. The Huns would force family members to watch as their relatives were sorted for slavery or death, and they would torture and kill some captives in front of others, to demonstrate what awaited those who displeased their new masters. The third day was reserved for the systematic destruction of the city itself. Every building was torn down, every monument was smashed, every piece of infrastructure was demolished. The Huns didn't just want to eliminate the city's military capacity, they wanted to erase all evidence that a civilized community had ever existed there. When they finally moved on, nothing remained of Marcianopolis but ash, rubble, and the smell of death. The site would remain uninhabited for decades, and even when it was eventually resettled, The new community was a pale shadow of the prosperous city that had existed before Attila's arrival. And this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most thorough campaigns of regional devastation in ancient history. From Marcianopolis, the Hun army moved through Thrace like a plague, destroying city after city with the same methodical thoroughness. Philippopolis, Arcadiopolis, Callipolis, Hadrianopolis, each name represents thousands of people who died horrible deaths and entire communities that were erased from history. But what made this campaign particularly terrifying was the speed at which it moved and the completeness of the destruction it left behind. The Huns had refined their siege techniques to maximize efficiency and psychological impact. They didn't get bogged down in long sieges or complex military operations. Instead, they would appear outside a city, demand immediate surrender, and then destroy it regardless of whether the inhabitants complied or resisted. Surrender might buy you a quicker death, but it wouldn't save your life or your city. Resistance guaranteed prolonged torture, but the end result was the same: total annihilation. The psychological impact of this approach was enormous. Each destroyed city sent waves of refugees fleeing toward Constantinople, carrying tales of Hun atrocities that grew more horrifying with each retelling. These refugees clogged the roads, consumed scarce resources, and spread panic throughout the empire. The Huns were destroying Roman morale and Roman infrastructure simultaneously, making effective resistance almost impossible. The Huns systematically devastated the countryside, destroying farms, killing livestock, and eliminating the agricultural base that supported urban populations. They burned forests, poisoned wells, and demolished bridges and roads. They were creating vast empty zones where nothing could survive, turning some of the most fertile and prosperous regions of the empire into uninhabitable wastelands. This systematic regional devastation was one of Attila's signature tactics and a key component of what made him so uniquely terrible. Other conquerors might destroy cities and kill populations, but they usually wanted to rule the territories they conquered. Attila was different. He seemed to take pleasure in rendering entire regions uninhabitable, creating empty spaces that would serve as monuments to his power. The devastation was so thorough that it would take generations for the affected regions to recover. Archaeological evidence from this period shows layer after layer of destruction: cities burned and abandoned, farms left to return to forest, and human settlements that simply vanished from the historical record. Some areas didn't regain their pre-447 population levels until the High Middle Ages, nearly 500 years later. The Eastern Roman Emperor, Theodosius II, finally managed to assemble an army large enough to challenge the Huns in open battle. The two forces met at the Battle of the Utus River, and the result was a catastrophic defeat for the Romans. The Hun cavalry tactics proved devastatingly effective against traditional Roman infantry formations. But what happened after the battle was even more devastating than the military defeat itself. Attila ordered that all Roman prisoners be executed, not quickly on the battlefield, but slowly and publicly, as an example to anyone who might still be thinking about resistance. Contemporary sources describe Roman soldiers being flayed alive, crucified, or burned to death while Attila watched from his throne, apparently taking pleasure in their suffering. This public torture of prisoners served no military purpose. The battle was already won, and Roman resistance was already broken, but it served a crucial psychological purpose by demonstrating that Attila was not bound by the normal rules of warfare or civilization. He was sending a message that anyone who opposed him could expect not just defeat, but deliberate, prolonged torture before death. The mass execution of prisoners also served to demonstrate Attila's complete contempt for the Christian values that supposedly governed Roman society. The Romans prided themselves on their civilization and their adherence to Christian principles of mercy and compassion. By torturing Roman soldiers to death in elaborate public ceremonies, Attila was showing that these values meant nothing to him and would provide no protection to his enemies. The campaign continued southward toward Constantinople itself, with Hun forces destroying everything in their path. By the time they reached the outskirts of the capital, they had devastated an area roughly the size of modern Greece, leaving behind a trail of empty cities, burned fields, and mass graves that would scar the landscape for generations. The scale of this devastation is hard to comprehend from a modern perspective. Entire regions that had been prosperous and heavily populated were reduced to empty wilderness. Cities that had stood for centuries were erased so completely that later historians would have difficulty determining where they had been located. The Hun army had essentially created a dead zone across much of the Balkans, an empty landscape that would serve as a buffer between the Hun Empire and what remained of Roman territory. But Attila's ultimate goal wasn't to capture Constantinople. It was to demonstrate that he could have captured it if he had chosen to do so. When the Romans finally agreed to his terms, which included massive tribute payments and the evacuation of a huge strip of territory along the Danube frontier, Attila withdrew his forces, leaving behind a clear message. The Roman Empire existed only because he allowed it to exist. The terms of the peace treaty that ended this campaign were humiliating for the Romans and established Attila as the dominant power in Europe. The Romans agreed to pay £6,000 of gold immediately, plus an annual tribute of £2,100 of gold. To put this in perspective, the total annual revenue of the Eastern Roman Empire at this time was approximately £270,000 of gold, meaning that the tribute to Attila represented nearly 8% of the empire's entire budget. They also agreed to evacuate all Roman settlements south of the Danube, creating a massive buffer zone that would remain empty of Roman presence. This forced evacuation displaced hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens, creating another wave of refugees that strained the empire's resources and demonstrated Hun power to populations throughout the Roman world. But the most psychologically devastating term was the requirement that the Romans could not form alliances against the Huns or provide aid to any people who were at war with Attila. This effectively made the Eastern Roman Empire, a client state of the Hun Empire, subordinate to a barbarian king who had demonstrated his power through systematic mass murder. The 447 campaign established Attila's reputation as the scourge of God, and demonstrated the effectiveness of his approach to warfare through terror. In a single year, he had forced one of the world's great empires to its knees, not just through military victory, but through the deliberate, systematic use of cruelty as a weapon of war. The success of this campaign had given Attila something even more valuable than gold or territory. It had given him a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. By 450 AD, the mere mention of his name was enough to cause panic in cities across Europe. Parents would frighten misbehaving children with threats that Attila will come for you. Soldiers would desert rather than face Hun armies in battle. Entire regions would evacuate at the first rumor of Hun approach. This reputation for absolute ruthlessness became a weapon more powerful than any army. When Attila decided to turn his attention westward toward Gaul and the Western Roman Empire, many cities would surrender without resistance, not because they expected mercy, but because they hoped surrender might earn them a quicker death than resistance would provide. But Attila had learned something important from his eastern campaigns. Total destruction was sometimes counterproductive. Dead cities paid no tribute, and empty lands provided no plunder. For his western campaigns, he would develop a more sophisticated approach that combined selective brutality with calculated mercy, using terror as a precision instrument rather than a blunt weapon. The invasion of Gaul began in the spring of 4051, with the crossing of the Rhine by what was probably the largest barbarian army ever assembled. Contemporary estimates put the size of Attila's force at anywhere from 300,000 to 700,000 warriors, though modern historians tend to favor numbers in the lower end of that range. Regardless of the exact size, this was an army large enough to alter the demographic balance of entire regions simply by passing through them. The sheer logistics of moving such a massive force were staggering. The army included not just Hun warriors, but also contingents from dozens of subject peoples and allied tribes: Ostrogoths, Gepids, Hurals, Rugians, Scuri, and many others. The baggage train alone stretched for miles, carrying siege equipment, supplies, and the accumulated loot from previous campaigns. But what made this army truly terrifying wasn't its size, it was its reputation. Every warrior in that vast host had heard stories of what had happened in the Balkans 5 years earlier. They knew they were following a king who had forced the mighty Roman Empire to its knees through sheer brutality. They expected to win, and they expected to be rewarded with plunder. slaves, and glory. The first major target was the city of Metz, which had the misfortune of being located directly in the path of the Hun advance. The siege of Metz demonstrated Attila's refined approach to psychological warfare. Rather than simply surrounding the city and starving it into submission, the Huns constructed elaborate siege works that were designed as much for theatrical effect as for military utility. Hun engineers built massive wooden towers that loomed over the city walls, not because they were necessary for the siege, but because they created a sense of looming doom for the defenders. They constructed catapults that hurled not just stones but also the severed heads of captured Romans, turning the siege into a gruesome spectacle that was visible from miles away. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of the siege was the treatment of captured civilians. The Huns would capture people from the surrounding countryside and bring them to the walls of the city, where they would be tortured and executed in full view of the defenders. These public executions served no military purpose, but they demonstrated to everyone watching that surrender would not bring safety or mercy. The siege lasted only 3 days, but those 3 days established a new standard for systematic cruelty in warfare. When the city finally fell, Attila allowed his warriors to massacre the population, but he did so in a carefully orchestrated way that maximized the psychological impact. Rather than allowing random slaughter, he organized the killing into a series of public spectacles that were designed to be witnessed and remembered. The destruction of Metz was followed by a march through Gaul that left a trail of devastation, unlike anything Europe had seen since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But this wasn't random destruction. It was a carefully planned campaign designed to demonstrate Hun power while advancing toward Attila's ultimate target, the wealthy city of Orleans. At each town and village along the route, Attila employed the same systematic approach. First came the demand for immediate surrender, then came the methodical destruction. Regardless of whether that surrender was offered or not, the message was always the same. Resistance was futile, but surrender offered no protection either. The only variable was how much you would suffer before you died. The Hun army moved like a plague across the countryside, consuming everything in its path and leaving nothing but ash and silence behind. Farms were burned, livestock slaughtered, wells poisoned, entire communities simply vanished, their populations either dead or marched away into slavery. The fertile valleys of eastern Gaul, which had supported prosperous agricultural communities for centuries, were transformed into empty wastelands. Orleans was one of the most important cities in Gaul, a major trading center with strong defenses and a large population. Its capture would give Attila control over the Loire River Valley and open the path to further conquests in southern Gaul. But more importantly, the siege of Orleans would provide an opportunity to demonstrate Hun military might to the combined Roman Visigothic army that was being assembled to oppose him. The siege of Orleans became the centerpiece of Attila's Gallic campaign, not just because of its strategic importance, but because it became a showcase for every technique of psychological warfare that the Huns had developed over the decades. The siege works built around Orleans were more elaborate than anything the Huns had previously constructed, featuring massive earthworks, siege towers, and catapults that could be seen from miles away. But the real horror of the Orleans siege was the systematic way the Huns went about breaking the morale of the defenders. They constructed massive pens outside the city walls where they kept thousands of captured civilians from the surrounding countryside. These captives were subjected to public torture sessions that were carefully timed to coincide with the changing of the guard on the city walls, ensuring that fresh groups of defenders would witness the fate that awaited them if the city fell. The Huns also employed a tactic that was particularly effective against Christian defenders. They deliberately targeted churches and religious sites in the surrounding area, not for their strategic value, but for their psychological impact. They would capture priests and nuns, torture them to death in view of the city walls, and use their vestments and religious artifacts as decorations for their siege engines. This systematic assault on Christian symbols and religious figures was designed to convince the defenders that God had abandoned them, and that resistance was not just futile, but sacrilegious. Contemporary accounts describe defenders becoming increasingly demoralized as they watched their sacred sites being desecrated and their religious leaders being murdered. The siege also featured innovations in psychological warfare that would have lasting impact on military thinking. The Huns constructed what can only be described as theaters of cruelty, raised platforms where captured civilians would be tortured and executed in full view of the city walls. These platforms were positioned so that defenders couldn't avoid seeing them, and the tortures were timed to coincide with mealtimes and guard changes to ensure maximum psychological impact. Children were used as psychological weapons in particularly cruel ways. Hun warriors would capture families from the surrounding countryside and force children to call out to their parents on the city walls, begging them to surrender to save their lives. When these pleas failed to produce the desired effect, the children would be killed slowly and publicly, while their parents watched helplessly from the walls. The Huns also employed a form of psychological warfare that targeted the defenders' sense of time and hope. They would announce that the torture and execution of captives would continue at regular intervals, every hour, every day at noon, every time the sun set, until the city surrendered. This created a countdown of horror that made every moment of resistance a conscious choice to allow more innocent suffering. The siege lasted for several weeks, during which time the Huns maintained a constant barrage of psychological warfare designed to break the will of the defenders without the expense and risk of a direct assault. They understood that a city taken by storm would be expensive in terms of casualties and might not provide the demonstration of power that Attila was seeking. But the siege was ultimately lifted when a combined Roman-Visigothic army, under the command of Aetius, arrived to challenge the Huns in open battle. This was exactly what Attila had been hoping for, a chance to demonstrate Hun military superiority against the combined forces of his enemies in front of witnesses who would carry the tale of his victory throughout Europe. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains, fought in June 451, was one of the largest and bloodiest battles in ancient history. The exact location of the battlefield is unknown, but it was somewhere in what is now northeastern France, and the casualties on both sides were enormous. Contemporary sources describe the battlefield as being covered with corpses so thickly that it was impossible to walk without stepping on bodies. The battle itself was a complex affair involving multiple armies and shifting alliances. On one side was Attila's massive force of Huns and allied Germanic tribes. On the other was an equally diverse coalition led by the Roman general Aetius, and including Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, and other peoples who had decided that the Hun threat needed to be stopped. But what made this battle particularly significant wasn't its size or its casualties. It was the fact that Attila, for the first time in his career, was forced to withdraw from a campaign without achieving his objectives. The Hun army wasn't destroyed, and Attila himself survived the battle, but the aura of invincibility that had surrounded him since 447 was finally broken. The battle demonstrated that Attila's forces could be stopped, that his psychological warfare tactics had limits, and that organized resistance could succeed against even the most terrifying enemy. Word of the Hun defeat spread quickly throughout Europe, inspiring hope in communities that had lived in terror of Attila's approach. The withdrawal from Gaul marked a turning point in Attila's career, but it didn't mark the end of his reign of terror. If anything, the setback in Gaul seemed to make him more determined than ever to demonstrate Hun power through increasingly extreme displays of cruelty. His next campaign, the invasion of Italy in 452, would represent the pinnacle of his systematic approach to warfare through terror. The Italian campaign began with the siege of Aquileia, a wealthy port city at the head of the Adriatic Sea. Aquileia was one of the largest and most prosperous cities in the Western Roman Empire, with strong fortifications and a large population that was confident in its ability to withstand a siege. That confidence was catastrophically misplaced. The siege of Aquileia became Attila's masterpiece of psychological warfare, a 3-month demonstration of systematic cruelty that was designed not just to capture the city, but to break the will of every other city in Italy. From the beginning, Attila made it clear that this siege would be different from his previous campaigns. This would be a war of extermination designed to erase Aquileia so completely that future generations would doubt it had ever existed. The Huns began the siege by surrounding the city with a series of concentric earthworks that were designed to prevent any escape or relief. But these weren't ordinary siege works. They were constructed using the forced labor of captured civilians who were worked to death in full view of the city walls. The defenders could watch their friends and neighbors being literally worked to death to build the instruments of their own destruction. The psychological impact of this forced labor system was enormous. The defenders weren't just watching the construction of siege works, they were watching their own people being murdered slowly and publicly as part of the siege process. This created a sense of helpless horror that was far more demoralizing than simple military pressure would have been. But the forced labor was just the beginning of Attila's psychological assault on Aquileia. As the siege progressed, the Huns began employing increasingly elaborate methods of public torture and execution that were specifically designed to be visible from the city walls. They constructed wooden platforms where captured civilians would be tortured for hours before being killed, with the torture sessions timed to coincide with meal times in the city so that defenders would be forced to watch while they tried to eat. The Huns also began using captured children as psychological weapons, forcing them to call out to their parents on the city walls and begging them to surrender. When these pleas failed to produce the desired effect, the children would be tortured and killed in view of their parents, creating trauma that was designed to break the will of the entire defending force. As the siege dragged on, the Huns began employing even more extreme tactics. They constructed massive funeral pyres, where they would burn captured civilians alive, creating columns of smoke that could be seen for miles and carrying the smell of burning flesh throughout the city. They used catapults to hurl the severed heads and dismembered body parts of captured defenders into the city, turning the very air into a weapon of psychological warfare. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating tactic employed during the siege was the systematic destruction of everything that gave the defenders hope or comfort. The Huns would capture priests and force them to renounce their faith before torturing them to death. They would desecrate churches and religious artifacts in elaborate public ceremonies. They would force captured nobles to publicly humiliate themselves before being executed. All of this was designed to convince the defenders that resistance was not just futile, but actively harmful to the people they were trying to protect. The message was clear. Every day the siege continued, more innocent people would die horrible deaths, and the only way to stop the suffering was to surrender. When Aquileia finally fell after 3 months of siege, the Huns' revenge was swift and absolute. Attila had promised that the city would be destroyed so completely that future travelers wouldn't be able to tell that it had ever existed, and he kept that promise with a thoroughness that was breathtaking in its scope. The massacre of Aquileia's population took several days and was conducted with the same systematic approach that had characterized the siege. The Huns didn't simply kill everyone they found. They organized the slaughter into a series of public spectacles that were designed to maximize the psychological impact on survivors and witnesses. Men were tortured before being killed, with their screams audible throughout the city. Women and children were enslaved, but many were killed anyway in elaborate public ceremonies. The elderly and infirm were burned alive in the city's churches, turning houses of worship into funeral pyres. But the physical destruction of the city was even more thorough than the massacre of its population. The Huns spent weeks systematically dismantling every building, monument and piece of infrastructure in Aquileia. Stones were pulled apart and scattered, wooden structures were burned, and even the foundations of buildings were dug up and destroyed. The Huns also went to extraordinary lengths to erase the cultural and historical memory of the city. They destroyed libraries, burned records, and smashed works of art. They even destroyed tombstones and grave markers, trying to eliminate any trace that the people of Aquileia had ever lived. When the destruction was finally complete, Aquileia had been erased so thoroughly that later historians would have difficulty determining exactly where it had been located. The site remained uninhabited for decades, and when it was finally resettled, the new settlement was much smaller and poorer than the original city had been. This complete depopulation and erasure of Aquileia represents the perfect example of what made Attila uniquely terrible among ancient conquerors. He didn't just want to defeat his enemies or even kill them, he wanted to eliminate every trace that they had ever existed. This wasn't conquest, it was systematic annihilation designed to serve as a warning to everyone else in the known world. The destruction of Aquileia sent shockwaves throughout Italy and across the Roman world. Here was proof that Attila could and would destroy even the largest and most prosperous cities if they resisted him. The psychological impact was enormous. City after city in northern Italy surrendered without resistance rather than face the fate that had befallen Aquileia. But Attila wasn't finished with Italy. From Aquileia, the Hun army moved westward, destroying cities and towns with the same systematic thoroughness. Altinum, Concordia, Padua, each name represents another community that was erased from the map, another population that was massacred or enslaved. another piece of Roman civilization that was ground into dust beneath Hun horses' hooves. The march through northern Italy became a masterclass in how to systematically depopulate entire regions. This wasn't the random destruction of an army running wild. This was calculated, methodical extermination designed to leave behind empty landscapes that would serve as monuments to Hun power for generations to come. At Ultinum, Attila ordered the entire population herded into the city's amphitheatre, the same structure that had once hosted gladiatorial games for their entertainment. There, they were forced to watch as Hun warriors systematically destroyed everything they had built over generations: their homes, their temples, their monuments to their ancestors, all reduced to rubble before their eyes while they sat helplessly in the seats where they had once cheered for blood sport. Only when their life's work had been completely destroyed were they finally slaughtered. But even then, Attila made sure the killing served multiple purposes. The executions were drawn out over hours, with the screams audible for miles around, serving as a warning to any other cities that might be considering resistance. The destruction of Concordia revealed an even more sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the deliberate breaking of social bonds. The Huns offered the inhabitants a choice that sounds like something from a twisted philosophy experiment. Half the population could live if they personally killed the other half. Those who refused were tortured to death slowly over several days, while those who complied were enslaved and forced to watch as their city was burned anyway. This wasn't just cruelty for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy to destroy the social fabric that held communities together. By forcing people to choose between their own survival and the lives of their neighbors, Attila was ensuring that even those who survived would be psychologically broken, unable to trust each other, or rebuild the bonds that had made their community strong. Padua faced perhaps the most elaborate and systematic cruelty of all. Attila had his engineers construct a series of wooden platforms throughout the city, each one designed for a different method of execution. Citizens were sorted by age, gender, and social status, then assigned to different platforms where they would die, in ways specifically chosen to maximize psychological impact. Children were killed in front of their parents. Parents were forced to choose which of their children would die first. Priests were made to renounce their faith before being crucified on the altars of their own churches. The wealthy were stripped naked and forced to beg for mercy before being flayed alive in the city's marketplace. But perhaps most horrifying of all was what happened to the city's scholars and teachers. Recognizing that knowledge and learning were what separated civilization from barbarism, Attila ordered that all educated people be subjected to special torments designed to humiliate and degrade their intelligence. They were forced to destroy their own books and scrolls, then made to eat the ashes. They were compelled to recite barbarian war songs while being slowly tortured to death. This systematic targeting of intellectual and cultural leaders wasn't random sadism. It was a calculated strategy to ensure that the communities he destroyed could never recover their former sophistication. By eliminating the people who preserved and transmitted knowledge, Attila was guaranteeing that even if survivors somehow managed to rebuild, they would never again achieve the level of civilization they had lost. The wave of refugees fleeing the Hun advance created a humanitarian disaster that extended far beyond the immediate victims of Hun atrocities. Hundreds of thousands of people abandoned their homes and fled southward, carrying tales of horror that spread panic throughout the peninsula. These refugees clogged roads, overwhelmed cities, and strained resources everywhere they went. But the refugee crisis served Attila's purposes perfectly. The displaced populations carried his reputation ahead of his armies, making psychological conquest easier than military conquest. Cities would surrender at the first rumor of Hun approach rather than face the fate that the refugees described in graphic detail. The refugees also served as unwitting intelligence assets, providing detailed information about the defenses, resources, and vulnerabilities of the cities they fled to. Hun spies moved among the refugee populations, gathering information that would be used in future campaigns. As the Hun forces approached Rome itself, something unexpected happened. Pope Leo I, later known as Leo the Great, rode out to meet Attila personally and negotiate for the city's survival. The exact details of their meeting are lost to history, but the result was clear. Attila agreed to withdraw from Italy without attacking Rome. Various explanations have been offered for this surprising decision. Some contemporary sources claimed it was a miracle, divine intervention that turned Attila's heart toward mercy. Others suggested that Attila was concerned about plague and disease that were spreading through his army, or that he was worried about being cut off from his supply lines if he advanced too far into Italy. But the most likely explanation is far more cynical and reveals something crucial about Attila's strategic thinking. He had already demonstrated his power by destroying Aquileia and terrorizing northern Italy. Attacking Rome would have been militarily costly and strategically unnecessary. The psychological impact had already been achieved. The Romans knew he could have taken their capital if he had chosen to do so, and that knowledge was worth more than the actual conquest would have been. This decision to spare Rome also reveals the sophisticated nature of Attila's cruelty. He understood that sometimes the threat of violence was more powerful than violence itself, as long as that threat was backed up by periodic demonstrations of what he was capable of doing. The destruction of Aquileia had served as that demonstration for Italy. Further destruction would have been redundant. The withdrawal from Italy marked the high point of Attila's power and reputation. He had brought two great empires to their knees through the systematic use of terror as a weapon of war. He had earned his title as the Scourge of God through campaigns that had devastated entire regions of Europe and left cities completely depopulated across vast areas of the continent. But Attila's reign of terror was about to come to an abrupt end. In 453 AD, just 1 year after his withdrawal from Italy, Attila died suddenly on his wedding night. The circumstances of his death remain mysterious. Some sources suggest he died of natural causes, others hint at assassination, and still others claim divine intervention. The most widely accepted account comes from the historian Priscus, who reported that Attila died from a nosebleed that choked him in his sleep after heavy drinking at his wedding feast. Whether this was a medical condition, poison, or something else entirely, we'll never know for certain. Regardless of the cause, Attila's death marked the beginning of the end for the Hun Empire. Without his unifying presence and terrifying reputation, the various tribal groups that made up the confederation began to fight among themselves. Within a few years, the Hun Empire had collapsed completely, and the various tribes had been absorbed into other political entities or had disappeared entirely from the historical record. But the legacy of Attila's cruelty lived on long after his death. The regions he had devastated remained largely uninhabited for generations. The techniques of psychological warfare he had developed influenced military thinking for centuries. The terror he had inspired became part of European folklore and would be invoked by conquerors and tyrants throughout history. More importantly, Attila had demonstrated something that would horrify and fascinate military leaders for centuries to come: that systematic cruelty could be an effective tool of statecraft, that terror could be more powerful than conventional military force, and that the complete destruction of enemy communities could serve strategic purposes beyond simple conquest. The four key aspects of Attila's historical infamy: his reputation as the Scourge of God, his systematic devastation of entire regions of Europe, his practice of mass slaughter and enslavement, and his policy of leaving cities completely depopulated, represented a new model of warfare that prioritized psychological impact over territorial gain. This model would be studied and emulated by future conquerors who understood that Attila had discovered something fundamental about human nature, that people would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid suffering the fate that Attila had inflicted on his victims. The fear of becoming another Aquileia, another empty city where nothing remained but ash and silence, proved to be one of the most powerful motivators in human history. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Attila's legacy is how it demonstrates the capacity of intelligent, sophisticated people to rationalize and systematize cruelty on an industrial scale. Attila wasn't a primitive savage driven by blind rage. He was a brilliant strategist who understood exactly what he was doing and why. He had figured out that in a world where communication was slow and military resources were limited, reputation could be more powerful than actual military strength. By creating a reputation for absolute ruthlessness backed up by periodic demonstrations of extreme cruelty, he could achieve through terror what would have required much larger armies and far more resources to accomplish through conventional conquest. This understanding of the strategic value of terror would influence military thinking throughout history, from medieval conquerors to modern dictatorships. The The techniques that Attila developed for psychological warfare, systematic destruction, and the complete elimination of enemy communities can be seen echoed in conflicts throughout history, right up to the present day. In the end, Attila the Hun represents something uniquely terrifying in human history, the perfect combination of intelligence and cruelty, of strategic brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. He was a man who understood that the most effective way to defeat your enemies wasn't just to kill them but to make them suffer so horribly that others would surrender rather than risk experiencing the same fate. His reign of terror lasted only about 8 years as sole ruler of the Huns, but in that brief time he managed to devastate entire regions of Europe, massacre or enslave over 1 million people, and create empty wastelands where once thriving communities had existed. He earned his title as the Scourge of God, through campaigns that redefined what it meant to wage war and what it meant to be cruel. Silent reminders that civilization is more fragile than we like to believe, and that the capacity for extraordinary cruelty lies dormant in the human heart, waiting for the right circumstances and the wrong leader to awaken it. But to truly understand the scope of Attila's impact, we need to look beyond the immediate devastation and examine how his campaigns fundamentally changed the political, social, and psychological landscape of Europe. Because the terror he unleashed didn't end with his death, it rippled outward through generations, shaping how people thought about war, authority, and survival for centuries to come. The demographic impact of Attila's campaigns was staggering in ways that are difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. Entire regions that had supported dense populations for centuries were turned into virtual wastelands. The Balkans, which had been one of the most prosperous and heavily populated regions of the Eastern Roman Empire, lost an estimated 60 to 70% of their population during and after Attila's 447 campaign. But it wasn't just the immediate deaths that created this demographic catastrophe. It was the systematic destruction of the economic and social infrastructure that made large populations possible. When Attila's forces destroyed farms, mills, granaries, and irrigation systems, they weren't just causing immediate hardship, they were eliminating the foundation that allowed communities to support themselves. Agricultural knowledge that had been passed down through generations was lost when entire farming communities were wiped out. Craft skills disappeared when artisans were killed or enslaved. Trade networks that had connected distant regions for centuries simply collapsed when the cities and towns that served as trading centers ceased to exist. The psychological impact was equally profound. Communities that had survived Attila's campaigns or heard credible reports about them developed what can only be described as collective trauma. The knowledge that an entire city could be erased from existence in a matter of days, that no war was strong enough and no army large enough to guarantee safety, fundamentally changed how people thought about their place in the world. This trauma manifested itself in various ways throughout the post-Attila period. Communities became obsessed with defensive preparations, investing enormous resources in walls, fortifications, and early warning systems that would have been considered unnecessary before Attila demonstrated what was possible. The very architecture of medieval Europe was shaped by the memory of what the Huns had accomplished. Religious attitudes also shifted dramatically. The title Scourge of God wasn't just political propaganda, it reflected a genuine theological crisis in Christian communities. If God was just and merciful, how could he allow such systematic evil to flourish? The traditional Christian understanding of suffering as divine punishment for sin was challenged by the obvious fact that Attila's victims included many devout Christians who had done nothing to deserve their fate. Some theologians developed the doctrine that Attila was indeed an instrument of divine wrath, sent to punish the Roman Empire for its moral corruption and spiritual weakness. Others argued that his success was a test of faith, designed to separate true believers from those whose devotion was merely superficial. Still others concluded that Attila represented pure evil, a manifestation of Satan's power in the world that Christians were obligated to resist at all costs. These theological debates had practical consequences that extended far beyond academic discussions. The idea that extreme cruelty could be divinely sanctioned became embedded in Christian thinking about warfare and justice. The concept of righteous violence, the belief that brutal methods were acceptable when used against enemies of God, can be traced directly to attempts to understand and justify resistance to Attila. the political consequences were equally far-reaching. Attila had demonstrated that even the mightiest empires were vulnerable to determined enemies who were willing to use unlimited violence. This lesson was not lost on the various barbarian groups that were scattered throughout Europe in the wake of the Hun Empire's collapse. The Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples had seen firsthand how effective Attila's methods could be. When they established their own kingdoms in the former territories of the Roman Empire, many adopted similar tactics of systematic intimidation and exemplary violence. The barbarian kingdoms that emerged in post-Roman Europe were often more militaristic and authoritarian than the Roman system they replaced, partly because their leaders had learned from Attila that fear was a more reliable foundation for power than legitimacy or popular support. The economic consequences of Attila's campaigns were equally transformative. The systematic destruction of urban centers and trade networks fundamentally altered the economic geography of Europe. Regions that had been economic powerhouses for centuries, like the Danube Valley, northern Italy, and parts of Gaul, never fully recovered their former prosperity. This economic disruption contributed to the broader collapse of the late Roman economic system, which had depended on long-distance trade, urban manufacturing, and complex financial networks. When Attila destroyed cities like Aquileia, he wasn't just eliminating individual communities, he was severing crucial links in economic chains that stretched across continents. The result was a profound economic simplification that historians call the ruralization of Europe. Without secure trade routes and stable urban markets, communities were forced to become much more self-sufficient. The complex, specialized economy of the late Roman Empire gave way to the simpler, more localized economy of medieval Europe. This economic transformation had social consequences that lasted for centuries. The destruction of urban centers eliminated many of the opportunities for social mobility that had existed in the Roman system. Without cities to provide markets for craft goods and services, most people were forced into agricultural subsistence that offered little hope of advancement. The cultural impact of Attila's campaigns was perhaps the most subtle but also the most enduring. The systematic destruction of libraries, schools, and centers of learning eliminated not just books and artifacts but entire intellectual traditions. Knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries was lost in a matter of days when Attila's forces burned cities like Aquileia and Padua. This cultural destruction was particularly devastating because the Roman world had not yet developed the decentralized monastery-based system of knowledge preservation that would characterize medieval Europe. Most learning was concentrated in urban centers, making it vulnerable to the kind of systematic destruction that Attila specialized in. The loss wasn't just quantitative. Entire ways of thinking disappeared along with the texts and teachers that had sustained them. The sophisticated legal scholarship that had developed Roman law, the engineering knowledge that had built the aqueducts and roads, the medical understanding that had made Roman cities relatively healthy places to live, all of this was disrupted by Attila's campaigns. But perhaps the most significant cultural impact was the way Attila's campaigns changed how people thought about civilization itself. Before Attila, there had been a widespread assumption that civilization was progressive, that human societies naturally became more sophisticated, more peaceful, and more just over time. The Roman Empire, despite its flaws, was seen as representing the pinnacle of human development. Attila shattered this optimistic worldview. He demonstrated that civilization was fragile, that centuries of progress could be undone in a matter of years, and that barbarism could triumph over culture through the simple application of superior violence. This realization created a profound pessimism about human nature and human possibilities that would influence European thinking for centuries. The psychological warfare techniques that Attila developed also had lasting influence on military thinking. His understanding that the fear of violence could be more powerful than violence itself, that reputation could substitute for actual strength, and that systematic cruelty could serve strategic purposes. All of these insights were studied and emulated by later military leaders. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of commanders who deliberately cultivated reputations for extreme cruelty in order to make their enemies more likely to surrender without fighting. The practice of making examples of captured enemies, of destroying cities so thoroughly that they could never be rebuilt, of using torture and execution as psychological weapons, all of these became standard standard features of medieval warfare. Even the specific techniques that Attila had pioneered continued to be used. The practice of forcing communities to choose between their own survival and the lives of their neighbors, the use of captured civilians as human shields, the deliberate targeting of religious and cultural symbols, all of these methods appear repeatedly in medieval military campaigns. The influence extended beyond Europe as well. When news of Attila's campaigns reached other parts of the world through trade networks and diplomatic contacts, military leaders in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East took note of his methods. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century, for example, employed many of the same psychological warfare techniques that Attila had developed, including the systematic destruction of cities that resisted and the cultivation of a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. But the most profound and lasting impact of Attila's campaigns was the way they changed fundamental assumptions about the relationship between power and morality. Before Attila, there had been at least a pretense that legitimate authority was based on justice, law, and the consent of the governed. Rulers might be cruel or tyrannical, but they generally felt obligated to justify their actions in terms of some higher moral or legal principle. Attila operated under no such constraints. He made no attempt to justify his actions in terms of law, justice, or divine will. He simply demonstrated that sufficient violence could overcome any opposition, and that terror could substitute for legitimacy. This was a fundamental challenge to the entire intellectual and moral framework that had governed European politics since the time of the Greeks. The response to this challenge varied, but it fundamentally altered European thinking about authority and resistance. Some thinkers concluded that might really did make right, that successful violence was its own justification. Others developed theories of legitimate resistance to tyranny, arguing that rulers who exceeded certain bounds of acceptable behavior forfeited their right to obedience. Still others retreated into religious or philosophical systems that attempted to preserve moral values by separating them from political reality. The growth of monasticism in post-Roman Europe, for example, can be seen partly as a response to the demonstration that worldly power was incompatible with moral principles. The legal consequences of Attila's campaigns were also significant. The systematic breakdown of Roman legal institutions in the territories he ravaged created a vacuum that was filled by various local and tribal legal systems. The sophisticated, written law that had governed the Roman Empire gave way to simpler, more personal systems based on custom, honor, and direct retaliation. This legal fragmentation contributed to the broader political fragmentation that characterized post-Roman Europe. Without common legal institutions to provide framework for resolving disputes, communities became more self-contained and more suspicious of outsiders. The universal citizenship that had been one of Rome's greatest achievements was replaced by a patchwork of local loyalties and tribal identities. The military consequences were equally far-reaching. Attila had demonstrated that traditional Roman military tactics, heavy infantry formations, siege warfare, and disciplined professional armies were vulnerable to mobile, lightly armed forces that could strike quickly and disappear before effective retaliation was possible. This lesson was absorbed by the various Germanic peoples who established kingdoms in former Roman territories. They developed military systems that emphasized cavalry, mobility, and psychological warfare, rather than the siegecraft and engineering that had been hallmarks of Roman military power. The knights and castles that would dominate medieval European warfare were in many ways responses to the military revolution that Attila had initiated. The technological consequences were subtler but equally important. The destruction of Roman industrial centers and the breakdown of long-distance trade networks disrupted the technological systems that had supported Roman civilization. Complex technologies that required specialized knowledge and coordinated production, like the hydraulic engineering that powered Roman mills and the metallurgy that produced high-quality steel, were lost when the communities that had maintained them were destroyed. This technological regression contributed to the broader economic and social changes that marked the transition from the ancient to the medieval world. Without the industrial capacity that had supported large urban populations, Europe was forced to adopt simpler, more labor-intensive economic systems that could operate without complex technological infrastructure. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Attila's campaigns was the way they shaped European attitudes toward cultural and ethnic diversity. Before Attila, the Roman Empire had been remarkably tolerant of cultural differences, Local customs, languages, and religious practices were generally permitted as long as they didn't challenge imperial authority. Attila's campaigns changed this. The systematic destruction that he wreaked was associated in many minds with his foreign origins and barbarian culture. This created a lasting suspicion of cultural outsiders and a tendency to associate difference with danger. The xenophobia that would characterize much of medieval European thinking about other cultures can be traced partly to the trauma of the Hun invasions. This cultural defensiveness had practical consequences that extended far beyond attitudes and beliefs. European communities became much more resistant to cultural exchange and innovation, preferring familiar ways of doing things to potentially superior methods that came from foreign sources. This cultural conservatism contributed to the technological and economic stagnation that marked much of the early medieval period. The religious consequences were equally complex. While Christianity ultimately survived and flourished in post-Attila Europe, the experience of the Hun invasions profoundly changed Christian thinking about violence, authority, and the relationship between faith and worldly power. The traditional Christian preference for pacifism and non-resistance was challenged by the obvious fact that these virtues had provided no protection against Attila's systematic cruelty. This led to the development of just war theories that attempted to reconcile Christian moral principles with the practical necessity of violent resistance to evil. These theological developments had enormous practical consequences. The idea that violence could be morally justified if it served a sufficiently righteous cause became embedded in Christian thinking, and would later be used to justify everything from the Crusades to the Inquisition. The concept of holy war, the belief that God not only permitted but commanded violence against his enemies, can be traced directly to attempts to understand and respond to the challenge that Attila had posed. The artistic and literary consequences were equally significant. The experience of the Hun invasions provided subject matter for countless medieval works of art and literature. Epic poems, chronicles, and legends preserved memories of Attila's campaigns, but these memories were often distorted by the passage of time and the needs of later audiences. Attila himself became a figure of legend, appearing in Germanic epics as both a terrible enemy and a powerful king worthy of respect. The historical Attila, the calculated, intelligent strategist who used systematic cruelty as a tool of statecraft, was gradually transformed into a mythical figure who embodied either pure evil or primitive heroism, depending on the needs of the story being told. These literary and artistic representations had their own historical impact. They preserved certain memories of Attila's campaigns while obscuring others, creating a popular understanding of the Hun invasions that was often quite different from the historical reality. The mythical Attila became a symbol that could be invoked to justify various political and military actions, even when those actions bore little resemblance to anything the historical Attila had actually done. The linguistic consequences were subtler but equally important. The disruption of Roman administrative and educational systems in the territories that Attila ravaged accelerated the fragmentation of Latin into the various Romance languages. Without schools and bureaucracies to maintain standardized Latin, local dialects diverged more rapidly from the classical language. This linguistic fragmentation contributed to the broader cultural and political fragmentation that characterized post-Roman Europe. Without a common language to facilitate communication across regions, it became much more difficult to maintain large-scale political and economic institutions. The demographic consequences extended far beyond the immediate death tolls of Attila's campaigns. The systematic destruction of urban centers and agricultural infrastructure created long-term population bottlenecks that affected European demographics for centuries. Regions that had supported large populations under Roman rule remained sparsely inhabited throughout much of the medieval period. This demographic decline had cascading effects on everything from military capabilities to technological development. Smaller populations meant fewer soldiers, fewer craftsmen, fewer scholars, and fewer innovators. The human capital that had supported Roman civilization was simply not available to early medieval European societies. The environmental consequences were equally significant. The abandonment of Roman agricultural and engineering systems led to the deterioration of farmland, the silting up of harbors, and the reversion of cultivated areas to wilderness. Landscapes that had been shaped by centuries of human activity returned to more natural states. But this wasn't necessarily an environmental improvement, since Roman land management had often been quite sophisticated. The psychological consequences extended far beyond the immediate survivors of Attila's campaigns. Stories of Hun atrocities were passed down through generations, creating a cultural memory of vulnerability and fear that influenced European behavior for centuries. The knowledge that civilization could be destroyed, that no community was truly safe, became embedded in European consciousness. This cultural anxiety manifested itself in various ways. The obsession with fortification that characterized medieval architecture, the development of feudal systems that prioritized military protection over economic efficiency, the tendency toward political fragmentation that made coordinated defense possible. All of these can be traced partly to the lasting impact of Attila's campaigns, but perhaps the most significant and enduring consequence of Attila's reign was the way it demonstrated the potential for intelligent individuals to cause suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. Attila wasn't a force of nature or a random catastrophe. He was a human being who made calculated decisions about how to use violence and terror to achieve his goals. This realization had profound implications for how Europeans thought about human nature, political authority, and moral responsibility. The optimistic assumptions about human perfectibility that had characterized much classical philosophy were challenged by the obvious fact that intelligence and education were no guarantee against evil. The response to this challenge took various forms. Some thinkers developed more pessimistic views of human nature, emphasizing the need for strong institutions to control natural human tendencies toward violence and selfishness. Others concluded that worldly power was inherently corrupting, and that true virtue could only be found in withdrawal from political life. Still others attempted to develop systems of thought that could account for the existence of figures like Attila, while still maintaining hope for human progress and moral development. These intellectual struggles would influence European thinking about politics, ethics, and human nature for centuries to come. The international consequences were equally far-reaching. Attila's campaigns demonstrated that even the most powerful empires were vulnerable to determined enemies who were willing to use unlimited violence. This lesson was absorbed by political leaders throughout the known world, leading to changes in diplomatic, military, and economic strategies that extended far beyond Europe. The collapse of Roman power in much of Europe also created opportunities for other powers to expand their influence. The Byzantine Empire, the Sassanid Persian Empire, and various Germanic kingdoms all adjusted their strategies to take advantage of the power vacuum that Attila's campaigns had helped to create. The ripple effects of these adjustments influenced political developments across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The rise of Islam in the 7th century, for example, was made possible partly by the weakening of Byzantine and Persian power that could be traced back to the disruptions caused by the Hun invasions. And as the centuries passed, the memory of Attila continued to influence European political and military thinking. Medieval chroniclers invoked his name when describing other conquerors and military leaders. Renaissance political theorists cited his campaigns as examples of the relationship between violence and power. Even modern military strategists have studied his use of psychological warfare and systematic terror. The techniques that Attila developed for using cruelty as a strategic weapon have been employed by conquerors and tyrants throughout history, from the Mongol invasions of the 13th century to the genocides of the 20th century. The basic principles that Attila discovered, that systematic cruelty can be more effective than random violence, that the fear of suffering can be more powerful than suffering itself, that reputation can substitute for actual military strength, have been rediscovered and re-implemented by leaders who understood the strategic value of terror. In this sense, Attila's legacy extends far beyond the specific historical period in which he lived. He represents a dark possibility in human nature, the capacity for intelligence to be combined with absolute ruthlessness, for strategic thinking to be applied to systematic cruelty, and for the desire for power to overcome every other human consideration. The cities that Attila left empty, the regions he turned into wastelands, the populations he scattered or enslaved, all of these stand as monuments to what human beings are capable of when they decide that other people's suffering is an acceptable price to pay for their own success. And the fact that his methods were so effective, that his reputation lasted so long, That his techniques were copied so widely serves as a reminder that the capacity for such evil is not limited to any particular time, place, or culture. As the night deepens and these stories of ancient cruelty fade into the darkness, remember that the forces that created Attila, ambition unchecked by morality, intelligence divorced from compassion, power pursued without regard for its human cost, are still present in our world today. The specific methods may change, the technology may advance, but the fundamental capacity for systematic evil remains part of the human condition. The empty cities of northern Italy still whisper their warnings across the centuries. The bones of Aquileia still cry out from beneath the soil, and somewhere in the darkness of human nature, the spirit of Attila still waits, ready to emerge whenever the circumstances are right and the wrong person finds themselves in a position to reshape the world through violence and terror. But to truly understand the full scope of what made Attila uniquely terrible, we need to examine not just what he did, but how he thought about what he was doing. Because unlike many historical figures whose motivations remain mysterious, we actually have detailed accounts of Attila's personality, methods, and worldview from people who knew him personally. The most valuable of these accounts comes from Priscus of Panium, a Byzantine diplomat, who spent several weeks in Attila's court in 449 AD. As part of a diplomatic mission, Priscus's writings provide us with an intimate portrait of a man whose intelligence was matched only by his complete lack of moral constraints. According to Priscus, Attila was a master of psychological manipulation who understood exactly how to read people and exploit their weaknesses. He would size up visitors within minutes of meeting them, determining whether they were motivated by fear, greed, ambition, or pride, and then tailor his approach accordingly. With Romans, he often played on their sense of cultural superiority, acting more barbaric than he actually was to make them underestimate him. With his own followers, he projected an image of supernatural authority that made questioning his decisions seem not just dangerous but impious. But what struck Priscus most was Attila's complete emotional detachment from the suffering he caused. When discussing his campaigns, Attila spoke about massacres and destruction the way other men might discuss the weather, as simple facts that required no explanation or justification. He showed no anger toward his enemies, no satisfaction in their destruction, just a cold calculation about what needed to be done to achieve his goals. This emotional detachment was perhaps more terrifying than rage would have been. An angry man might be reasoned with or appeased. A man driven by passion might be distracted or redirected, but Attila's cruelty was purely instrumental, a tool that he used with the same dispassion that a carpenter might use a hammer. There was no emotion to appeal to, no conscience to awaken, no humanity to reach. Priscus also noted Attila's remarkable memory and attention to detail. He could recall the exact terms of treaties signed years earlier, remember the names and relationships of minor officials in distant cities, and keep track of complex political situations across his vast empire. This intellectual capacity made his cruelty even more chilling because it was so clearly deliberate and systematic. But perhaps most disturbing was Attila's apparent enjoyment of the intellectual challenge involved in devising new forms of psychological warfare. He would spend hours discussing different methods of breaking enemy morale, comparing the effectiveness of various forms of torture, and analyzing the psychological impact of different types of destruction. For him, cruelty was not just a means to an end, it was an art form that he was constantly working to perfect. This intellectual approach to violence extended to every aspect of his military campaigns. Attila didn't just attack cities randomly. He carefully selected targets that would have maximum psychological impact. He didn't just kill people indiscriminately. He developed elaborate methods of execution that were specifically designed to terrorize witnesses. He didn't just destroy buildings. He created spectacles of destruction that would be remembered and talked about for generations. The systematic nature of Attila's approach can be seen in the way he organized his army's logistics. Unlike other nomadic leaders who relied on spontaneous raiding, Attila developed sophisticated systems for feeding, supplying, and coordinating his massive forces. He established supply depots, organized intelligence networks, and created communication systems that allowed him to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. But these same organizational skills were applied to the business of destruction with equally devastating effect. Attila's forces didn't just stumble upon cities and destroy them in the heat of battle. They arrived with detailed plans for siege operations, specific assignments for different units, and carefully orchestrated sequences of psychological warfare designed to break enemy resistance before the actual fighting began. The siege equipment that Attila's armies used was often designed as much for psychological impact as for military effectiveness. Catapults were positioned not just to breach walls but to be visible from inside the city, creating a constant reminder of impending doom. Siege towers were built taller than necessary to loom menacingly over defenders. Even the camps that the Hun forces established outside besieged cities were arranged to create maximum psychological pressure on the inhabitants. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Attila's approach was his understanding of how information spread in the ancient world. He knew that stories of his campaigns would travel faster than his armies, and he deliberately crafted those stories to serve his purposes. Survivors of his attacks weren't spared randomly. They were carefully selected to ensure that the right kinds of witnesses would carry the right kinds of stories to the right destinations. The refugees who fled Attila's advance weren't just collateral damage. They were unwitting agents of psychological warfare who carried tales of Hun atrocities to communities that hadn't yet been attacked. These stories, growing more terrifying with each retelling, often convinced cities to surrender without fighting rather than face the fate that the refugees described. Attila also understood the importance of maintaining his reputation over time. He knew that if too much time passed between demonstrations of his power, people might begin to think he had grown weak or lost his edge. This is why his campaigns followed a regular pattern, periods of diplomacy and tribute collection, punctuated by sudden, devastating displays of violence that reminded everyone why they should be afraid of him. The tribute system that Attila developed was itself a form of psychological warfare. The payments weren't just about extracting wealth, they were about maintaining a constant reminder of Hun dominance. Every time Roman officials had to gather gold to send to Attila, every time they had to negotiate the terms of their own subjugation, they were reinforcing the psychological relationship between the empire and its barbarian master. But Attila's most innovative contribution to the art of terror was his understanding of how to use mercy as a weapon. Unlike some conquerors who killed indiscriminately, Attila was selective in his violence. He would spare some cities while destroying others, creating a climate of uncertainty that was often more effective than universal destruction would have been. Communities that had been spared never knew whether their good fortune was permanent or temporary. They lived in constant fear that they might be next, that some change in circumstance might cause Attila to decide that an example needed to be made. This uncertainty was psychologically devastating and politically useful. It kept potential enemies off balance and prevented them from organizing effective resistance. The legal and administrative innovations that Attila developed for governing his empire were equally sophisticated. Unlike other barbarian confederations that were held together primarily by personal loyalty and the promise of plunder, the Hun Empire under Attila developed genuine governmental institutions that could function across vast distances and diverse populations. Attila created a legal system that combined Hun customary law with elements borrowed from Roman jurisprudence, but modified to serve his particular needs. The most distinctive feature of this legal system was its emphasis on collective responsibility and exemplary punishment. Communities were held responsible for the actions of their individual members, and punishments were deliberately designed to be visible and memorable. He divided his empire into administrative units that cut across traditional tribal boundaries, making it more difficult for subject peoples to organize rebellion along ethnic lines. He appointed governors who were responsible directly to him rather than to local tribal leaders, creating a centralized command structure that was unprecedented among nomadic peoples. But perhaps most importantly, Attila developed systems for gathering and processing intelligence that gave him detailed knowledge of political, economic, and military conditions throughout Europe. He maintained networks of spies and informants in major cities, cultivated relationships with merchants and diplomats who could provide information about distant regions, and even recruited scholars who could help him understand the complex political relationships that governed the civilized world. This intelligence network allowed Attila to strike at exactly the right moments when his enemies were weakest and least prepared for attack. It also allowed him to exploit political divisions within the Roman Empire, playing different factions against each other and preventing the kind of unified response that might have been able to stop his campaigns. The economic policies that Attila developed were equally sophisticated. Rather than simply raiding and plundering in the traditional barbarian manner, he created systems for extracting wealth on a sustainable basis. The tribute payments that he demanded from the Roman Empire were carefully calculated to extract maximum wealth without completely destroying the economic systems that generated that wealth. Attila understood that dead cities paid no tribute, and that completely devastated regions produced no wealth to be extracted. This is why his campaigns followed a pattern of selective destruction rather than universal annihilation. He would destroy enough to demonstrate his power and discourage resistance, but preserve enough to maintain the economic base that supported his empire. The military innovations that Attila developed went far beyond the traditional Hun emphasis on cavalry and archery. He incorporated siege techniques borrowed from Roman and Persian military engineering, developed new methods for coordinating large armies across vast distances, and created tactical systems that could adapt to different types of terrain and enemy formations. But perhaps his most important military innovation was his development of what we might call psychological operations, systematic methods for using terror, propaganda, and disinformation to achieve military objectives without fighting. Attila understood that the most effective victories were those that were achieved before the battle began, and he developed elaborate techniques for convincing enemies that resistance was futile. These psychological operations were integrated into every aspect of his military campaigns. The advance of Hun armies was preceded by carefully orchestrated propaganda campaigns designed to spread fear and confusion among potential enemies. The siege of cities involved elaborate psychological warfare designed to break the will of defenders. Even the aftermath of victories was carefully managed to ensure maximum psychological impact on future enemies. Unlike some conquerors who tried to impose their own cultural and religious practices on subject peoples, Attila generally allowed conquered communities to maintain their traditional ways of life. This tolerance wasn't based on respect for diversity. It was based on his understanding that cultural persecution often provoked resistance. Instead of trying to change how people lived and worshipped, Attila focused on changing how they thought about power and authority. He wanted subject peoples to accept Hun dominance as a fact of life, something that was too powerful and too permanent to be worth challenging. Cultural and religious tolerance helped achieve this goal by making Hun rule seem less threatening and more acceptable. But this tolerance had limits, and those limits were strategically defined. Attila was quick to suppress any cultural or religious practices that might serve as rallying points for resistance. Religious leaders who preached against Hun rule were eliminated. Cultural traditions that emphasized independence or resistance were discouraged. Festivals and ceremonies that brought large groups of people together were monitored and controlled. The technological policies that Attila developed were equally sophisticated. He understood that technological knowledge was a source of power, and he made systematic efforts to recruit and protect craftsmen, engineers, and scholars who possessed useful skills. Rather than killing these people during his campaigns, he would often spare them and bring them back to serve his empire. This technological recruitment had military applications. Hun armies began using siege engines and fortification techniques that were clearly borrowed from Roman military engineering, but it also had broader economic and administrative applications. The governmental systems that Attila developed incorporated administrative techniques and record-keeping methods that were clearly derived from Roman bureaucratic practices. The diplomatic innovations that Attila developed were perhaps his most subtle but also his most effective tools for maintaining power. He understood that military force alone was insufficient to govern a vast empire populated by diverse peoples with different languages, cultures, and traditions. He needed diplomatic techniques that could maintain control without requiring constant military intervention. Attila developed a sophisticated system of divide-and-rule tactics that played different groups against each other and prevented the emergence of unified opposition to Hun rule. He would support one faction against another in internal disputes, ensuring that no group became powerful enough to challenge Hun authority. He would offer preferential treatment to some communities while threatening others, creating incentives for loyalty and competition for Hun favor. But perhaps his most effective diplomatic innovation was his development of what we might call terror diplomacy, the use of carefully calibrated displays of violence to achieve political objectives without having to resort to large-scale warfare. A single, well-publicized massacre could often achieve the same results as a major military campaign at a fraction of the cost and risk. This terror diplomacy was particularly effective because it was unpredictable. Communities never knew when they might become the target of an exemplary punishment or what they might do to provoke such punishment. This uncertainty kept potential enemies constantly off balance and made them more likely to comply with Hun demands, rather than risk the consequences of resistance. The legacy of these innovations extended far beyond Attila's own lifetime. The techniques that he developed for using terror as a political tool, for coordinating large-scale military operations, for gathering and processing intelligence, and for managing diverse populations within a single political system, all influenced later military and political leaders. The Mongol Empire of the 13th century employed many of the same techniques that Attila had pioneered 7 centuries earlier: the systematic use of terror to discourage resistance, the careful coordination of intelligence gathering and military operations, the development of administrative systems that could govern diverse populations. All of these characterized both the Hun and Mongol empires. Similarly, many of the techniques that modern authoritarian regimes use to maintain control can be traced back to innovations that Attila first developed: the use of exemplary punishment to discourage resistance, the cultivation of informant networks to monitor subject populations, the manipulation of ethnic and religious divisions to prevent unified opposition. All of these are recognizable descendants of techniques that Attila perfected. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Attila's innovations was the demonstration that systematic cruelty could be an effective tool of statecraft. Before Attila, violence was generally seen as a failure of political systems, something that happened when diplomacy, law, and normal governmental processes broke down. Attila demonstrated that violence could be a primary tool of governance, not just a last resort. This lesson was absorbed by political leaders throughout history, who found themselves in situations where traditional methods of maintaining authority were insufficient. From medieval kings dealing with rebellious nobles to modern dictators managing restive populations, the example of Attila has provided a template for how systematic violence can be used to achieve political objectives. The moral and philosophical implications of Attila's success have troubled thinkers for centuries. If systematic cruelty can be effective, if terror can substitute for legitimacy, if fear can be more powerful than law or justice, then what does this say about human nature and the possibilities for moral progress? These questions became particularly acute during periods of crisis, when traditional political and social institutions were under stress. The collapse of the Roman Empire, the Black Death, the religious wars of the Reformation, the totalitarian movements of the 20th century. All of these periods saw renewed interest in Attila's methods, and renewed debate about whether such methods could ever be morally justified. The fact that Attila's techniques have been so widely studied and emulated suggests that there is something fundamental about human psychology that makes terror an effective tool of control. People are willing to endure considerable suffering and injustice if they believe that resistance will only make things worse. The fear of punishment often outweighs the desire for freedom, especially when that punishment is severe, certain, and arbitrary. This psychological reality has profound implications for how we think about political systems, human rights, and the possibilities for moral progress. It suggests that the capacity for systematic evil is not limited to particular cultures or historical periods, but is instead a permanent feature of human nature that emerges whenever circumstances permit and the wrong people find themselves in positions of power. The technological dimensions of this problem have only become more acute with time. Attila's capacity for systematic destruction was limited by the technology available to him: horses, swords, and the organizational techniques of the 5th century. Modern technology provides vastly greater capacity for both surveillance and destruction, making the techniques that Attila pioneered potentially far more dangerous than they were in his own time. The combination of modern surveillance technology with ancient techniques of psychological manipulation creates possibilities for control that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. The capacity to monitor populations continuously, to predict and prevent resistance before it develops, to target punishment with precision, while maintaining plausible deniability. All of these represent the evolution of techniques that Attila first developed. But technology also creates new possibilities for resistance and accountability that didn't exist in Attila's time. Modern communication systems make it more difficult to control information and prevent the spread of opposition movements. International human rights law and institutions create at least theoretical constraints on the behavior of political leaders. Global economic interdependence makes isolation and self-sufficiency more difficult to achieve and maintain. Whether these technological and institutional developments represent genuine progress or merely new forms of the same fundamental problems remains an open question. The persistence of systematic violence and oppression in the modern world suggests that the lessons of Attila's success remain relevant, even as the specific techniques and technologies involved continue to evolve. The story of Attila the Hun thus represents more than just an episode in ancient history. It represents a permanent challenge to human moral development, a demonstration that intelligence, organization, and strategic thinking can be applied to evil purposes as easily as to good ones. The techniques that he developed for systematically destroying human communities and terrorizing entire populations remain part of the human repertoire of possibilities, available to anyone with sufficient ambition and lack of moral constraint. The empty cities of northern Italy, the depopulated regions of the Balkans, the scattered refugee populations that fled his advance, all of these stand as monuments to what human beings are capable of when they decide that other people's suffering is an acceptable price to pay for their own success. And the fact that his methods were so effective, that his reputation lasted so long, that his techniques were copied so widely, serves as a reminder that the capacity for such evil is not limited to any particular time, place, or culture. As we close this dark journey through the mind and methods of history's most cruel king, remember that the forces that created Attila, the ambition, the intelligence, the complete absence of moral constraint, are still present in our world today. The specific technologies may change, the ideological justifications may evolve, but the fundamental capacity for systematic evil remains part of the human condition. The whispered warnings from the ruins of Aquileia still echo across the centuries. Civilization is fragile, cruelty can be systematic, and the worst monsters in human history often look remarkably like ordinary people who simply lack the conscience to restrain their ambition. In a world that still struggles with genocide, terrorism, and authoritarian violence, the story of Attila the Hun remains as relevant today as it was 15 centuries ago. Sweet dreams, and remember, the greatest evil in human history has always come, not from madness, but from intelligence without conscience, ambition without morality, and power without any limits except those imposed by the courage of ordinary people willing to say no more.